Hello! Today you guys are going to be learning about important slavery topics in this little interactive lecture, so here we go. Now all of this information is going to be testable, so you want to make sure to do your very best on getting down some good notes, and I'll show you how to set up your notebook page in just a second. So there are the four essentials, right? The Constitution, abolitionism, slave rebellions, and runaway slaves. So here's how you're going to set up your notebook. So you're going to have four boxes or squares, one per topic. And as you come across the question, write it in one of the four boxes. So make sure you get the question down first. And then pause the video when you need to. Get down details from the lecture for underneath each question. All right, so here's your first question to write down. How did the Constitution provide direct and indirect protections of slavery? And there were a lot of them. So the next thing, these are the four things that I'm going to focus on in terms of the Constitution. We've got the Three-Fifths Clause, we've got the Slave Trade Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the use of U.S. militias to keep a lid on things. You don't need to write these four ideas down. You're going to come across them again in just a second. So here's the Three-Fifths Clause. Now remember, anytime you need to pause the video, please do so you can get down some notes, okay? So the Three-Fifths Clause was put into the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 because there was a fight over representation, right? And so Southern states wanted to have more representation in the House of Representatives. And how could they do that? They decided to go ahead and count their African American slaves as part of the general population, even though these people had no rights. They were not considered citizens or anything like that. They were considered property, right? So what they did is Charles Pinckney, this guy from South Carolina, he said, well, let's make it so 3/5 of the number of slaves in any particular state would be added to the total number of free white persons, including bond servants but not Indians, to the estimated number of congressmen each state would send to the House of Representatives. Because we know that for the Senate, it's two senators from each state who go, right, to make up that legislative body. And then for the House of Representatives, currently we have 435 members in there, and it's divided up based on the populations of states. And so this was a big deal to Southern states. Now, the Slave Trade Clause is another part in the Constitution that you guys should be aware of. So Congress was to allow the slave trade to remain in business until 1808. They didn't have to end it in 1808. They wound up passing an act in 1807, which gave slave traders 9 months to finish up their business. There are a couple of reasons why they decided to end it that you should be aware of. One is that the slave population in North America was actually doing much better than it was in other parts of the Americas. Like in Brazil, they had to keep importing people because slaves were dying off in large numbers and the work was incredibly harsh. Same with the Caribbean. But in North America, the population was kind of taking care of itself. Slaves were having children, those children were surviving. And as we know that any mother who happened to be a slave, if she had a child, her child would also be considered a slave, regardless of the status of the father, whether he was free or slave. So, first reason, slave population, self-sustaining. The second reason, some white people were starting to get nervous about the numbers of black people as compared to white people in southern states. And they were afraid that there might be more rebellions or things like that because there were a bunch of rebellions that happened that went on that really scared some of the slaveholders. So they said, man, maybe we shouldn't import that many people anymore because we shouldn't try to be too outnumbered here. And then also the third reason is Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time. He was a slaveholder himself. He was against the transatlantic slave trade, okay? But the Slave Trade Clause was in existence in the Constitution, and it allowed things to stay that way until 1808. All right? The thing is, though, in 1808, when it ended, it wasn't exactly enforced very well. There were still ships with human cargo coming over into North America, because Congress didn't really fund the law very much. Imagine that. So that's what happens when we don't fund things, right? Not good. So the next thing you guys should be aware of is the Fugitive Slave Clause. Now, for this was a big deal, and it's coming from Article 4 of the Constitution, where basically it said that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Basically saying that a slave is considered property, and he's not dismissed from service just because he runs away to a free state or something like that, or runs away from his master. Nope, he's going to be delivered back to his master. So that's what that was all about. And there were a few fugitive slave laws that were put into effect, each kind of worse than the next, to discourage slaves from running away. So there's also, in the Constitution, there is a guarantee of military help, basically. So if you experience a slave rebellion or something like that, the U.S. militias will come to your service to help you out. And that shows up in two parts of the Constitution. So in Article 1, it allows for the use of U.S. forces to put down any rebellions that might rise up. And then in Article 4, guaranteed that U.S. government would protect states from slave rebellions. So they would basically send in the troops if the slaves were rising up. And again, these are all protections that the southern states wanted. So here's your second question. Please go ahead and pause the video so you can get this down. We have, who were some of the major abolitionists and what were their methods for trying to end slavery? So there's a few of them that we're going to look at. We know about Frederick Douglass. We also know about Harriet Tubman. But there's a few others I'm going to introduce you to. So the ones that we're going to find out about are William Lloyd Garrison, and then we've got David Walker, who wrote an appeal that was very sensational, caused quite a stir. Then we have the American Colonization Society, which was started up by the Quakers. But then also some slaveholders were also in on this, so it was kind of a weird duo. And then we have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a sympathizer. So the first one that I want you to be aware of is William Lloyd Garrison. So he was friends with Frederick Douglass. He's actually the one who encouraged Frederick Douglass to get up on stage and speak in front of an audience for the first time. William Lloyd Garrison wanted abolition to happen right away. He didn't want to wait. He didn't want a gradual process. He wanted it to happen now. He wrote a newspaper called The Liberator, which circulated pretty widely. And then he also founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. Now, the thing with William Lloyd Garrison that's kind of interesting is he and Frederick Douglass were friends at first, but then Frederick Douglass started to become more popular than him. And so I think my take on it is William Lloyd Garrison got a little bit jealous of that. And when Frederick Douglass started up his own newspaper called the North Star, William Lloyd Garrison was kind of beside himself. And so the two didn't talk for a long time, though eventually they did become friends again. Now, David Walker, he was a free black man in North Carolina. His mother was free, so that's why he was free. And his father was a slave. So in 1829, pardon the typo, he wrote an appeal to the sea citizens of the world. And so basically this was a pamphlet that told slaves that they should rise up, they should revolt against their masters, they should throw off slavery. And this pamphlet was distributed in the South. And basically it was packed into these crates. And Walker knew that who was going to open the boxes? Well, the slaves were going to open boxes. So he figured, let's stuff these boxes or these crates with all these pamphlets. And then maybe there'll be some slaves who can read and they'll be able to look at it and go, aha, maybe this will give them an idea as to how to revolt or how to rebel. So slaveholders caught on to this, though, and they had some pretty stiff punishments for anyone who was caught reading it. But it caused quite a stir. Now, this is I think, a really fascinating part of history to be aware of. The American Colonization Society was the first group to really start the Back to Africa movement, which is something that has kind of come up again and again over the centuries in America. So it was started in 1816 by the Quakers, and they were a Christian religious group that was fiercely opposed to slavery. And so their idea was to take black people out of America and send them back to Africa on ships. And so they actually created this colony that was called Monrovia at first. It was named after President Monroe. It's now called Liberia. So it is a country that is over in Africa. You can see it on the map. And there were 86 black Americans who went to Liberia in 1822. They were the first to go. So there were a lot of abolitionists, though, who were opposed to this idea. They thought it kind of stunk because they said, well, wait a second. African Americans have lived in this country now for quite a while. We should integrate society. They should be able to stay here. This is their home. A lot of African Americans felt that way, too. But starting in 1824, until the Civil War in the 1860s, there were 19,000 black Americans who went to Liberia. Plus, there were also 5,000 recaptured slaves who were traveling on slave ships who also headed to Liberia. What's really interesting, though, is that they took a lot of American culture and traditions with them. So they started up kind of a very similar political system in Liberia as a result of their experience, I guess, or their witness to American democracy. They wanted to start up something very similar there. Over the centuries, though, Liberia's had a whole lot of problems, and there has been a lot of corruption. There have been some authoritarian leaders, and the country was kind of steered in the wrong direction in I guess it was like the 1980s especially. There was a civil war that broke out until the early 2000s when they held their first free elections. And you can see the Liberian flag there. It looks very similar to the United States flag. And there's a picture of the president's house, President Joseph Roberts. That was his house. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And even though this book contained a lot of kind of terrible stereotypes that we would recognize now if we read it, like kind of dangerous stereotypes, when it was written at the time, it really opened a lot of people's eyes to the conditions of slavery and what slavery was like, and it kind of put it on a human level for many people, where a lot of people in the North started to move towards the abolitionist movement. So it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and while the book was fictional, it contained a lot of truth to it on the horrors of slavery. And it was written in 1852, and it really did educate a whole lot of people about what slavery was really like. So this is where part 1 of our lecture ends. And so I will see you in just a few minutes after you answer some questions to do the second half.